Thanks for stopping by Pete's Garage. Alright, now in this video, I'm going to wrap up the wiring that I was cleaning up for the Cobra. And I wanted to include the startup, the computer, the tuning, the whole thing. But after I finished wiring it and I went to start it up, I had a ginormous oh shit moment. One of those oh shit moments when your freaking stomach drops through your colon. It was really bad. So I didn't want to edit it out because there's something to be learned here. You can learn from what happened to me. Everything doesn't always go as planned. And you'll see later in the video what happened. I'll leave it in there. But let's start with finishing up the wiring. Now that this side is cleaned up from the fuse box to the wiring harness to all my connectors, and I'll talk about the steering column connector in a bit. But I have to go over here, and now I have to clean up this mess. Now this side is going to take a little bit of time to clean up because of all these wires. These are all the fuel injector harness and all the wires for the computer. Instead of wasting your time and showing you that, that's going to be pretty boring. I'll just show you the before. But what I was talking about all of the spots I need on those terminals for wires, I have many wires in here. You can see that there are a lot of wires that are positive plus wires, and they all go to one wire. And it's going to help out a lot if I can take these and instead of have them joined together like all these grounds that are hooked together in this wiring harness. Instead of wires being joined like this, I can take those and put them individually on the plus side of either the ignition or accessory, and it'll help it a lot, be a lot easier if I have to troubleshoot. So this is what it looks like before. And here's what it looks like all finished. I cut a bunch of wire out of here, and here's all the wire I cut out. Some of those are 30 inches, some of them are like 4 feet long. But I cut out all that wire, and a couple things to note is I had my ground bar here. The ground bar was on top. I moved that to the bottom, so I had room for my relays up here. There's a fuel pump relay and the relay for the injectors. I added a little bus bar here just to get my signal goes back. This is the fuel pump and power to go to my injector relay. I took that off of the fuse box. Now, since I'm not using all of the fuses like the door locks or windows, I'm not using that, so I just stole one of those power wires, ran it over to here, and that's power for my injectors. So you can do that. Lucky I had a couple spots extra on the fuse panel. Now I left one of these wires, well, one of these wires is too long. This goes to the fuel pump relay, and I'm going to show you how I went about doing this. People are going to say, well, how did you do it? Why didn't you show us? Well, because all in all, it took, I'm going to say if I worked straight, it would probably take about 25, 30 hours to do it neatly, to make sure all of the connections are made, they're crimped, but I also solder them on there, and I put the heat shrink on every wire to make sure it's neat and clean. And it takes a lot of time. And don't be afraid to do it. All you need is your wiring diagram and your wire chart that tells you what goes to what. But what I did was, as I cut, I just put tags on every wire to indicate what it is. So here it is basically. There's like 37 wires in here I cut. These are all Molex connectors. This is what a Molex connector looks like. They're really small. And I changed all of these wires. So what I basically did was I cut all these wires so that I would know what position they went in. Then I would just pull the wire as long as I wanted to have it, snipped it, put it in, installed it, and made them all short. And this is a lot simpler than it looks. This is the interface. This is the connector for the computer when you want to do the tuning. So this is my connector for the computer. There's also one over here that hooks up to the O2 sensor controller. So we'll hook that up to do the initial startup. And it looks like a lot of wires, but as I went through it, it's actually fairly simple. There's 8 wires here that go out to the injectors. There's wires here that go to the sensors that come back to run the engine. All of these pink wires are now in, these are all power for the ignition power. So when you turn the key on, I get ignition power there, and it powers everything from the spark box, O2 sensor controller, and you get power coming back to here for the computer. Power coming here, power going out to sensors out on the engine, power to the relays up on top, and then up here, these connectors up here are pretty simple. You got a signal that goes to the dual sync distributor, and in the back are wires that go to all the sensors on the top of the engine, which are the map sensor, things like that. Also added in here is a small light, which is temporary. This will mount in the dashboard. That's like my little check engine light, little blue light that indicates what the status of the computer is. And this is just tied into here. And these are all, these pink wires here, these wires come back, and these are all tied together and send a signal back through this little black wire, this white wire. This goes back, and that's like the malfunction indicator light. So this will be on my dashboard. That'll be my blue light of death if something happens there. Hopefully that works fine. Now, before I start this up, a couple things. We're going to shorten this wire. I'll show you how I shorten these, how that connector works, those Molex connectors. And then I'll have to hook up the dashboard because I want to have some oil pressure. I want to know what's going on. That is the only thing the computer will not tell you on the tuning screen is oil pressure. So I need the gauge to actually do that. But everything else, the computer will tell you. It'll tell you RPMs, coolant temperature, all that stuff is monitored through the computer. So let's get started with this connector right here. All right, this is what I'm doing with these connectors, how I'm putting it on there. These are Molex connectors, that's the name of them, and they're crimp-on connectors. And in order to do that, you have to, here's the other end. I have one here that's finished. And you can see it's crimped on in this area here, and then this is just wrapped around the wire to hold it. So I'll show you how this works. These Molex connectors they're really pretty neat. And this is the way you can do most connectors, almost all of them. You get your wire stripped, and you get it in there, and I have it just to hold it. Now this tool is something you need for these connectors, and there are different letters on here, A, B, C, D. There's different progressive. You can see there's different sizes, and this is a very small connector, so I'm using the smallest connector here, and these are like, this acts like a die. So when I put this on here and crimp that, it's going to crimp, it's going to act like a die, and it's going to put that little shape in there. Puts that shape in there, if you can see that, much like this side. See that double crimp over, it holds the wire. Same thing on this side. I just put that crimp in there, and that matches up with this die right here. Put that in there, crimp it, then all I have to do is fold over the two wires here that are holding the wire down, and that's how the connector works. All right, so now this wire is shorter. It's nice and neat. See, it comes right down into the harness. I'll put a little tie strap on there just to hold them together. But I want to get this started. So now we're basically ready to start. And before I do that, like I said, I'm just going to put the dashboard in place so I have an oil pressure gauge so I can watch the oil while the engine is being started. Well, before I put the dashboard up here, I guess I should really do an electrical test. I put some twist ties on there just to hold these wires, but I want to do a quick test. I got the positive, I got the battery all hooked up. I just want to turn it on, make sure my fuel pump relay comes on. I can hear the fuel pump goes on. My light should come on indicating the computer is on, and then it'll shut off, and I should get some power to my spark box. So let's give it a shot. Listen for the fuel pump. All right. All indications are we should be good. Everything appears to be okay, ready to start. And that is the understatement of the year. And it's still early in the year. Here comes the oh shit moment. Okay, the most nerve-wracking part of it, make sure it starts. My computer's all hooked up. I got to hook up to I got to turn it on, connect to the ECU, so I'll turn it on. My blue light comes on, goes off, got power. I got to connect to here. Alright, so now I'm communicating, I'm live to the computer. I put some fuel in the carb. Opened up in the fuel throttle body. My gauges have power. All right, here we go. You know the old saying, if anything can go wrong, it will. Well, this is what happened. I have been turning the ignition on and off, and unbeknownst to me, because you can't see, the injector in cylinder number 1 was stuck open. Something was wrong with the injector, it was leaking. And what it did, it filled up number 1 cylinder with gas. And it must have been maybe halfway up on the compression stroke. And the reason I know this is because as soon as I turned it on, it came up to the top, it hydrolocked, and you heard it fire. And what it did, blew up the starter. Starter blew up, just blew up right there. So when I turned the key again, starter wasn't engaging. Blew up the starter, $150 starter. Okay, lesson number 1. If you're going to store your car or any engine for any period of time, and the gasoline has ethanol in it, I'm using 92 octane with 10% ethanol, and it sat a lot longer than I should have, than I wanted to. Even though the environment is controlled in here, it doesn't get too hot or too cold, there's still enough humidity and there's probably enough moisture in that gasoline with the ethanol in there to cause something to rust. And my guess is, I'm going to take it apart and look, my guess is the pintle, the needle inside the injector, was working and it got stuck open. It had to be stuck open to let that much fuel pump into a cylinder, so we'll find out. So the lesson here is, if you're going to store something for any period of time, make sure you put an additive in the fuel, run the engine so that it gets into the carburetor, it gets into the engine, it gets in the fuel system to prevent any of the parts from rusting, any of the seals from failing, and ending up in a complete failure. So this is what happened, and here's the lesson for all of you. So what happened? Hydrolock. Fuel in the cylinder caused not compressible, too much fuel, piston comes up, spark plug fires, and it kicks back. So the starter is driving one direction, the engine forces back the other way, blows up the starter. And I'll tell you, when that happened, I was looking for my lungs. I might drop the lung with that. It just, my heart was like, oh shit, right? So I tried to turn it over by hand and the engine was locked up. So I started taking out the spark plugs, praying that it was a hydrolock. Got the number 1 cylinder, turned it over, and just gasoline just poured right out of it. Poured out of the cylinder, a lot of gas. So that's why I'm saying it was probably on its way back up to the compression stroke. Took the starter off, found out it was broken. I fished the part out of there. I checked in there with my bore scope to make sure there was nothing left. I have all the parts, so I think it's good. So I turned the engine over by hand, and then I made sure that it was nice and smooth all the way through, checked the valves, made sure nothing else was hitting, checked the flywheel, checked everything to make sure this, so I'm fairly confident that I have a leaking injector. The injector filled up the bore, or filled up the cylinder with gasoline on the compression stroke, hydrolock, the gasoline could not compress, the spark plug fired, kicked the engine backwards before it got to top dead center, blew up the starter, and I'll tell you, when that happened, as soon as I heard it, it sounded like the crank broke in half. It was unbelievable. But anyway, I took it apart. Now it's working fine. I drained all the oil. There was no gasoline in the oil. There was no gasoline anywhere else except for that cylinder. And here is the teachable moment for us. That's why I included it in there. Let's start with this. The engine had been running. I've had it run, I've driven it, it's been fine. But it's been sitting for a while. I'm going to guess it's been sitting for 6 to 8 months. And I turned it over a couple times previously to this, but what I didn't do here, and this is what I didn't do, I should have disconnected the coil, and I should have turned the engine over to let it crank to see if it builds oil pressure. Then if I saw it built oil pressure, I would have smelled the gasoline coming out of the exhaust. It would have poured out of the exhaust. I would have smelled it and I could have stopped and saved myself some aggravation. But now that I know I have a leaky injector, I have to buy a whole new set of injectors. I don't know, $400 or $500 plus a new starter. So we're looking at $650 to fix this back to shape. So think about that when you're starting up or restarting an engine. The first thing, pull off the coil wire and turn it over by hand and make sure you have oil pressure first. Make sure everything is working. Make sure the fuel is working properly. And fuel isn't dumping on the ground, obviously. And then hook the coil wire up and do it that way. If I would have done that, It may have started, and it may have ran. I probably would have ran. I guess it would have. But the injector was leaking, and the next time I went to start it, same thing would have happened. So that's a lesson that I can share with you. That's why I don't edit out things that go wrong. That went horribly wrong. It's going to take some time. I got to get some new injectors, put them on there. But I'll get it fixed, and we'll go back to getting it started, and we'll do the tuning. Thanks for stopping by Pete's Garage.